Hi, and welcome back to ConTinual. I'm your host, Jim Nettles, and tonight we're going to be talking about all sorts of things related to ships, navies, vessels, and writing about spaceships. Before we get started, let's go around the room and find out who is joining for the conversation. So, Frank, you're up first.
Hi, my name is Frank W. Butterfield. I'm the author of 97 novels, short stories, and novellas that are all gay fiction, romance, mostly mystery and historical fiction. And I'm really glad to be here.
Don?
My name's Donald J. Bingle. I've written some spy thrillers, some near future military sci-fi, and a bunch of stories.
Jack?
My name's John Hemry. I write under the pen name Jack Campbell. I'm retired Navy, ship driver, a lot of other things. Most well known for the Lost Fleet series. Dauntless is the first of those. And also did the Jag in Space series using my naval experience.
And Dennis?
I'm Dennis Myers. I write science fiction in the Automated Empire universe. My current series is Rise of the Automated Empire, the origin story, and it is available on Amazon.
So let's sort of start with the setting it up to talk a little bit about your background with the Navy, for those of you that have it, your experience, what has led you to write in some of these spaces, do research in these kinds of spaces. So, Frank, I'll start with you on that question.
Well, my history with the Navy is that I was a contractor, contracted to the Navy Litigation Office at the Navy Yard in D.C., and we handled very large litigation, which took me kind of all over the world to different naval facilities to find documents and whatnot. But what I write about is actually my main character, Nick Williams, who is the primary in my main series, and his experience being in the Navy, having volunteered the day after Pearl Harbor, and then served all the way through to like August of 45. And he was made a corpsman and was in one of the first classes at Great Lakes when they were ramping that up, and then ended up on the Solace for 2 years, and then spent the rest of his time at Hospital 13 in New Guinea, and which was nothing. It was like the back of the beyond. And so my research has been about that time, but I'm also really interested in the fact that the Navy itself contributed heavily to how San Francisco changed as a city because of everybody who was demobilized there. And a lot of people stayed and didn't leave because they couldn't go back home for whatever reason. I'm particularly interested in how that formed a gay community in San Francisco that had sort of existed, but didn't exist to the same level that it did after the war. So that's a lot of what I'm interested in. And also the blue ticket system, which most people don't know about, is the predecessor to the dishonorable discharge for being gay, or in the case of the Navy, a lot, being black. So those are the things that I'm focused on.
Don?
Well, I don't have a Navy background of any sort, and I think the most important thing for writers who may be wanting to write about the military or the Navy who don't have that background is to remember two things. One is, don't pretend to be something that you're not. And second is that just like you can write about aliens and monsters from the id and serial killers and all sorts of things that you may not have personal experience with, you can write characters who have been in the military, and you can write about people who have been on ships if you do your research and you contact people and are respectful and get information from them.
Jack?
Well, of course, spent a lot of time on ships, so and a lot of time with different services and all the different specialties out there. And of course, naval service took me to a lot of different places, worked with different nationalities. So all of that was research which eventually comes out in the novels in various ways. For example, doing three-dimensional battles in space, one thing you have to know as a ship driver is relative motion, is understanding large objects, momentum, and how they move in relation to each other. And so that helped me be able to visualize actual three-dimensional battles in space a great deal. And also, of course, as was alluded to earlier, I think, command relationships, the relationships between officers and enlisted. You see a lot of, especially the media portrayals, the Star Trek type shows where the officers are the big experts on everything, and the captain is the biggest expert on everything and understands the systems better than anyone. And no, you have to bring out the importance of the enlisted in actually keeping things working. Found it remarkable. Star Trek had one chief petty officer in the entire Starfleet, O'Brien. So apparently he was the only guy who didn't need work. Everybody else just were just the officers and kind of faking it. So all of those things go into it, of course, and dealing with the different specialties helps you understand how they think and how they talk, because they're all different. Engineers, intelligence, supply, they all think differently. They're their own form of alien species, if you will, to each other.
Dennis?
For me, it was the relationship between the characters and the crew. In mine, it's 1,000 years in the future, so most jobs on the ship are automated. And you have a very small crew. In the case of my ship, my hero ship, it's designed for 12 people, but they're running with 5, and understaffed, and just pushing through. So I play with how formality kind of breaks down a little bit, and people get overly familiar with each other. And over the course of the series, as they go from peacetime and transition into wartime, that changes. And you can see the change in how, when they're just doing their normal patrols, which might be shooting at and scaring protesters, to where there's an actual battle going on, the language, the feeling, the tenseness is very different. And then that's a lot of my experience on board the submarine. If it was just normal operations, people were fairly casual. But you had a drill go down and people got into that mode of being professional and doing it exactly correctly, and making sure they knew how to do it. So you see the difference in how people relate.
So diving a little bit deeper into that, when we start talking about fiction and nonfiction, we start talking about working with command structures. When you start talking about working with stories set at sea, I mean, if you are working, or even if it's not necessarily at sea, but you're working on the base side, it's still a very different life from than you would face on the civilian side, right? So when you look at this, how does this, just the nature of this, change the kind of story you're going to tell? Don?
Well, the military things that I've written about have not been in situations where there's a large command structure. I have a near future military sci-fi that is a squad that is left on a largely depopulated Earth after mankind has converted to virtual reality. And they're there to find the people that may not have converted and convert them. It's clear in that situation there's not a command structure above them, and discipline is broken down somewhat, and they're not a cohesive group in some ways, and they don't necessarily understand why they have to do things in a certain way, although they've been told to do it. So that is kind of a military structure that is tending a little bit towards Lord of the Flies, and that's, that was an interesting dynamic to develop. The other part of what my writing involves has to do with very kind of specialized aspects of what a particular character's background is, or what is happening in my Morse code stories, what is happening with the signal operators. And so I was able to focus in on a very narrow group of people and try to understand that and talk to beta readers and sources that were knowledgeable about a very small slice of things.
Jack, how about you? How does just the general approach of writing about the military differ from when you're trying to tell that kind of a story versus, other forms of fiction or even other forms of military fiction?
Well, one thing about the military that civilians can't grasp, and it's a challenge, is that getting across just how insane it can be, the ridiculous things that can happen, the people who end up in command positions even though they're unqualified, and the orders you get. You actually have to tone down real military things so that civilians will believe them. You know, that old saying that the difference between fiction and real life is that fiction has to be believable. Well, if you really put some of the things, I found that when you put things that really happened in the military in some of these books, people would say, that couldn't possibly happen. That's ridiculous. No, yeah, it does. So I actually have to translate it into civilian terms, tone it down so they would say, oh, okay, I guess we can accept this. Most of my writing in one way or another tends to focus on leadership challenges and everything involved in that, whether I'm talking about a non-commissioned officer with just a few people, or a junior officer, or even in the Lost Fleet, somebody who finds himself thrust in command of a fleet. The challenges you face dealing with the people you're responsible for and how you address those issues. There's nothing simple about it, even though, well, it kind of epitomizes the thing Clausewitz said about war, where he said, everything in war is simple, but all the simple things are very complicated. And that's kind of what leadership is like. You know, the basic principles are very simple, but actually doing right by your people and getting things done despite a system which often seems designed to keep things from being done, that's all very complicated. So trying to get that across, I think, is a big part of what I write.
Dennis, how about you?
You know, I spent the first part of my Navy career after training. My first boat was in the shipyard. And so I had a lot of experience with the shipyard and some of the crazy stuff going on in there. And I thinking back on it, that might be why one of the big complaints that the captain has when he's talking to the admiral is they've got 3 different incompatible missile systems on board a ship that's designed for one. And, you know, it's basically because somebody up high in the command is lining their pockets, having a different system installed, you know, a little bit of corruption there. The main thing I like playing with, I said before, the ship's crew is very small. Well, you form a bond that's very, very tight when that happens. And when one officer goes off somewhere else and accidentally gets themselves into some serious trouble, what's the rest of the crew willing to do to help him? And that's actually the subject of one of the main plots in the second book. Came out November 17th in Precipice. That's the second book. Following what they are willing to go and do, which throws them in a heap of trouble, of course.
Right?
Well, when I talk about the command structure, it's always from the perspective, because of when I'm writing, of how it follows the veterans when they get home and when they get back into their civilian life. And particularly because I'm writing about a gay community in San Francisco where the assumption is everybody served, and I have 2 characters who didn't. one was a fireman and one was a police officer. And the reason why they didn't serve is because their command structure within those agencies told them, don't sign up. We don't want you to leave. Because they were afraid that because it was San Francisco and they were afraid the Japanese were going to bomb San Francisco. That was the general idea right after Pearl Harbor. And so there's that part. And then there's so since they didn't serve, but they were in a command structure of their own, but as anybody who knows the difference between police and military, they're very, very different. Everything is very different. It looks the same, it sounds the same, but it's actually very different. And the way people interact is different. So there's that part, and how when they're interacting with their employees, because this is part of what I'm building in this universe, is they own this company that is basically a very large private investigation firm, and all their employees are gay cops and firemen who were going to get fired because it's the 50s. And this is a place where they can go to have refuge and actually have a job and do good work, and how that reflects throughout the company and how all the different things that happen as a result of that. Because there's all this fraternization that wouldn't have happened otherwise because of how they're kind of come together. But the thing that I find the most fascinating about writing about the civilian side, the post-war veterans in civilian life, is the complete and utter astonishing abundance of PTSD that nobody recognizes, understands, or knows anything about. That's actually driving everything that happens in the 50s. And it's just all over the place. And when I'm writing, it will pop up in all these weird places where it's really obvious that if some guy shows up, he's going to have something. If he served, he's going to have something that's really going to be hitting him hard that he doesn't understand or know about, because there was no conversation about it. There was some. I mean, people still talked about shell shock, but it wasn't like what we know now. And that, to me, is one of the more interesting parts of writing in that time period, because the Navy's everywhere, along with the other armed services, but it's nowhere to be seen, but it's everywhere, and it's in every part of life. And that, I would imagine, because I was born in '66, I think that went well into the era of Vietnam, when Vietnam kind of took a curve, and suddenly it wasn't everybody on board. It became a much more select crowd for a whole bunch of different reasons, and that's continued. So like now, civilians versus military is a very distinct group, whereas in the 50s, most everybody had been in the military or knew somebody who had been. And now that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. Mm-hmm. So I like writing about that because it brings that to light. And again, I realize I'm kind of going off topic, but the command structure is like everywhere, because the Navy is everywhere, particularly in San Francisco. Even if nobody's in the Navy, they've been touched by it in some way.
Mm. Well, and that's kind of where I wanted to go with the next question, is to talk about realistically, what does command structure mean, right? Because this is one of those things that most people, if you've never served, you have no real idea of what does command structure mean. You may, if you're used to working in a civilian environment, you understand management teams and things like this, or maybe you've worked in public service and there's ideas of command structure. But, the difference just between officers and enlisted, things like this that are materially different. So I kind of want to set this up to talk through, what do we really mean by command structure? What does this mean to the people that are serving there? What does it mean as people do work together? What does it mean when the crazy things happen versus when things, when real life begins to happen, when you go to war, when you have incidents that are going on, when you have crises, when you have emergencies, how that shifts and changes how people react. Because frequently when we look at and tell stories in fiction, we're not necessarily looking at how people would typically react when we put them under pressure, versus people that have been trained to deal with pressure are going to react differently. But, and Frank, much like you're talking about here, over time that leads to PTSD and other things. But so Jack, from your standpoint, can you talk a little bit about, in terms of command structure and how some of these things play together, and how you leverage some of these things, and how that makes a difference in ultimately the stories you tell and the characters you're working?
Well, yeah, one of the things you have to get across is how much authority officers have relative to enlisted, and particularly when you get into commanding officers. There's one book where I have a character basically say the captain is God. And navies in particular, I mean, they're designed with a structure for operating a long ways from home for extended periods. So the commanding officers have a tremendous amount of discretion and authority they can use for better or for worse. Hopefully for better for the crew, but not always. So getting across just how much power differential there is there, even between the captain and the junior officers on a ship, and then the enlisted, of course. But then you've got warrant officers and chief petty officers, sergeants, who the senior enlisted have, they have their own kind of authority that you have to recognize based on their knowledge and their experience. And you try to bring across how that's has to be acknowledged by smart officers, that you don't disrespect the senior enlisted. If you're smart, you don't disrespect them, because they can make things very difficult for anyone who doesn't treat them with the respect they're due. So getting that across is a major issue. And then the whole question of lawful and unlawful orders. What orders can this structure give? Even a commanding officer is bound by certain rules about what they can order. They're bound by whatever the legal system is. In the U.S., it's the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and as well as the general instructions in the U.S., for example, that you have to obey a lawful order, but you cannot obey an unlawful order. So you have to know what the difference is. You're expected to know what the difference is. And again, that's something that you have to get across to people, that even though there's this immense amount of power in people, you can literally order people to go to their deaths. But at the same time, there's things you can't order them to do because there's rules against that. So getting across those contradictions and that whole structure is, well, it's a challenge. But by using people and their interactions, I think you can get that across.
Dennis?
Oh, I'm sitting here going through visions of one of the movies I remember seeing, where the captain had to basically order somebody to go underwater in the aft and open a valve, even though that person knew there was no way they were coming back from that. It was a submarine movie, of course. One of the things that I play with is the hero ship ends up switching to a different organization during the course of events. And where they were in a military, a corporate military, very professional and all of that, they end up with Luna, which is a post-scarcity civilization where people have the freedom to do whatever they feel like doing. And if they want something, they ask for it. It gets, printed up for them immediately. And they end up being a test bed for a new prototype engine. When things happen and they have to go fight a battle, there are people on board the ship that go, nope, I'm getting off here, which at least one of the officers has a visceral reaction to, because that's not how you behave if you're a member of the crew. You're like, no, we're not members of no, bye. So that whole civilian military right there, I have to figure out a way, well, the characters figured out a way over the course of events to form a new military structure within that freedom that these individuals have. And that's fun to play with.
Right?
Well, one of the ways that I talk about the command structure in my books, and it doesn't come up in most of my stories, but there's some flashbacks that Nick has from when he's in the Navy. And one of my favorite things is actually something I kind of sort of saw myself indirectly. One of the people that I worked for, who was in the Navy, a civilian employee, had actually been in the construction battalion during the 60s. And he had some really, really wild ass stories. And so then I heard those stories like 20, 25 years ago. And then in writing about, in particular, a group of Seabees in New Guinea, I went back to Tales of the South Pacific, which from everything I've read from people who were actually there, they say it's very accurate. It's accurate in the way that it captures the chaotic, wild, wild west aspect of what was literally happening across the South Pacific, because it was such a vast structure that was spread across so many islands. And so it's one of my favorite things to talk about is there's this kind of like, there are these structures and substructures that kind of build into these like little private fiefdoms that happen solely within the enlisted, and they're like known but tolerated by the commanding officers because it's necessary in order to keep them in line. And in the movie South Pacific, and this is kind of pointed at, but when I put it kind of like down as like an actual thing that would actually happen, where there aren't people bursting into song all of a sudden, it becomes this very kind of like frightening thing of like, if you're not in that group, you're going to be in trouble. And that's what the guy I worked for one of the things he talked about was how really harassing they were of anybody who was not one of them. And it was kind of their way of like being rebellious against the command structure itself that went kind of horizontal, but it also went vertical. And again, like I said, he had some great stories, but that's where I've kind of like seen it the most. And myself as a contractor, I haven't yet been able to incorporate this into a story because I'm not in the right time frame yet, but I've bumped up against the command structure in the Navy and in the Marine Corps. And it was very unpleasant because I was there to help everybody. I was employed to work for them and to help them. And they treated me like the enemy almost all the time. And it was like, I had to figure out little ways to strategically kind of like ferret my way in. And one way I discovered, just by the way, was if I got a JAG officer on my side, he would then spread the good news to everybody else. But I couldn't go directly to anyone, including the civilians that we were literally there to defend. It had to be a JAG officer, had to be like kind of like the person who held our hands and led us into the organization. Because apparently, from what I could see, they trusted the JAG officers above everybody else. And that may just be my assumption, and I haven't found a way yet to incorporate that into a story, but it's coming because I need to wait until my characters are in kind of the modern era and can kind of see some of that from their perspective. So I find all of this fascinating, and the more I write about it, the more I think about it, the more I know that I'm really, really glad I never volunteered, because I would have been a terrible sailor or soldier. Terrible, terrible, terrible.
Don?
More than probably running into command structure problems, one of the things that I focus on with certain of my characters is that I think people who have been in the Navy or other branches of the military, not only do they have special training and with weapons and fighting and whatever, but they've also focused in on thinking about danger and death and that kind of thing, and so they don't react to situations in the same way that I think many civilians would, who have never really thought too much about what they might do in a certain situation or what the proper thing to do in a certain situation might be. And I think that can give some insight into the characters and promote some interesting juxtapositions. At one point in one of my stories, the characters are in a bad situation and the guy says one last thing, and she says, "Yeah, I'm not supposed to die." And he says, "Oh, I'm prepared for you to die. I'm prepared for me to die. I don't want you to die, doing something stupid. I don't want you to die, not taking care of what you need to get done." And that's not, I think, the kind of reaction that most civilians would have in that situation. But I think somebody who has some training would, and some structure and discipline would. And that can be maybe the good part of it. On the other hand, I've had conversations with people in the military, that have been in bad situations, and one was a helicopter pilot who knew of a situation where the pilots of the pilot and co-pilot of the helicopter were killed, and somebody that they were carrying basically jumped in and saved the day and landed the helicopter safely and saved everybody. And you'd think, well, that person should be up for a medal. And their reaction at that base was actually that the guy was lucky he didn't get court-martialed because he was flying an aircraft and he wasn't certified to do that. And it's just, it's a bizarre situation. I think that one's kind of extreme, but most people wouldn't think of it that way. There's a different mindset.
Yeah. So let's shift a little bit for the moment. And actually, let's talk a little bit about how vessels come into play, right? Because as a setting, when you're on different forms of vessels, and Jack, kind of going to that idea of, understanding how large masses move, how they shift, how they change direction, how confining they can be, how and how when you are literally all trapped in the same place, same locale, you're in a rack that's a little larger than a bread box. Dennis, let's sort of talk a little bit about how you look and approach vessels since you were a sub guy, since you were a submariner.
Well, obviously, my hero ship has a similar shape to there it is, submarine. For me, it was all about the inside, the internal structure, and the cramped quarters, the piping running everywhere, and the various pieces of equipment that were stuck into different corners. And then you have spaces like the missile compartment, which have long stretches of emptiness in between on either side of the tubes or whatnot. In mine, I also had to manage oxygen in a way that you don't have to so much on a real submarine, because on a real submarine, if you need more oxygen, you bring water on board and you split the water into hydrogen and oxygen, and you pump the hydrogen over and you've got plenty of oxygen. You will never run out of air to breathe underway. Well, in space, that ain't true. And when you have a crew of 5 on a ship designed for 12, you've got all the oxygen you need, and then you take on 500 refugees, and you've got a problem. And so I had fun figuring that out, managing where did the people go. I set up a situation where there was a large void that they could pack a lot of people into, but that was fun to work out, and most of that was because I could visualize the space inside the ship from my own experience going to sea on one of these things.
Right? What about you? Approaching.
Well, I don't have nearly the kind of experience that Dennis and Jack have, but there are 2 things that I've written about. One is, and it's not a direct part of any story, it's just part of like tales that Nick will tell. But when he was on the Solace, and his sense that he was literally working all the time. It was like he would work 16 hours and he would sleep for 8. If he was lucky to do that, because there was never not a need to work, because it was a hospital ship and there was always something going on. And that kind of gets back to something that Don was saying about, like, when as a private investigator who comes across a lot of dead bodies, he doesn't have much of a reaction to it because he's seen a lot of people mangled and falling apart and bleeding, and so he just kind of is very not casual, but he immediately kind of focuses in on like what's the essential part, whereas his partner, who is a fireman, doesn't really understand any of that, and it takes him a while to kind of get accustomed to seeing dead bodies. So the Solace is like this whole thing of like being confined to like always being at work for 2 years. And in fact, when he's finally transferred to New Guinea, it's actually because he he crossed paths with a commanding officer who, his XO actually, who wanted to kick him off. And so that's how he got moved. And at the end, he is like, okay, well, that was a good thing because now I have this whole jungle and I don't really have anything to do because they never had any patience hardly. Because they were like literally at the back of the beyond. And the only time they ever got anybody was Iwo Jima, and that was barely anybody because they were so far away from everything by the time he got there. But my favorite little story, though, about a ship is and it's a running gag throughout all the books, is that he has a Zippo lighter that's bent. And every time he uses it, somebody sees him, they're like, how did that get bent? And he has a whole lot of different ways of talking about it, but he basically, if he's somebody in the know, somebody in the life, he'll say, this is what happens when you put two sailors in a bunk built for one, and they spend the whole night together. You end up with a Zippo that looks like this. And that's the running joke that goes through almost every book that he's in. It's one of my favorite little stories because there are lots of, well, I shouldn't say lots, but there's a handful of really good stories that people have told, like oral histories about, particularly when they were coming home, because that's when that happened from Honolulu to San Francisco, of like just how crazy it was in those transport ships as people were being sent back because they were done, they were ready to get home, and like the war was over, and just the stuff that went on those ships. I haven't begun to explore that, and I would really like to write a story about just that particular voyage, because I'm sure there would be a lot of really fun things to find out about and to explore in that. But the confinement in both cases is still the same. It's just a lot of people on a ship who are there for a very specific purpose, and there's just no way to get away from it. You're just in it completely. So,
one of the things I focused on in my Morse Code Mysteries and Mrs. book, there's a couple fictional stories, but there's also I include the radio traffic from the North Atlantic on the night the Titanic sank. And one of the things that you really focus in on when you do that is, it's a couple of things. One, how professional basically the people are. But the other thing is how slow ships move and how far away a ship will respond to a distress call. Because there were, compared to what most civilians experience, driving here and there and going to places, the concept of the speed of a ship on the open ocean just would seem dreadfully slow. And some of these ships are hundreds and hundreds of miles away that are going to take, 20, 30 hours to arrive on scene. And they immediately alter their course and, head for where they're supposed to head in an emergency. And the distances involved are just something I think, and the time involved are something that people don't understand well.
So Jack, what about you? What are your thoughts in terms of the vessels and how they come into play and just what people should be thinking about?
Well, the first thing I did when I'm writing about space is, analyze the environment. And you need something that'll hold pressure well, which is why my ships have rounded hulls. It's not because of air resistance. It's because corners and edges are where stress builds up and things crack. And there's a reason you don't see square water tanks anywhere. They're always got rounded edges. So these designs you see of ships that have lots of sharp edges and things sticking out, those don't really make a lot of sense from an engineering point of view. And then the thrust has to have a center of gravity to push through, or else your ship's going to go in circles or something every time you try to accelerate. So putting those in fact, and as Dennis remarked, it's a warship. You don't want everything neatly hidden behind the bulkheads. You need all the electrical lines, the cables, the ducts, the pipes, all that needs to be out in the open where you can get to it if something goes wrong. It's a very important part of the environment, and it's going to be kind of cramped because extra space that's a luxury on any ship. And as was alluded to, the sheer size of space is very difficult for us to grasp. It is so immense. So you have to think of that in terms of, as well, in terms of how long it takes to get from point A to point B. I think it's a mistake. A lot of stories just kind of skip over that, and you've got this instantaneous, they can cover the distance. But that distance is a big complication to anything you want to do, and it's the complications that make the stories strong. Yeah, and the workload on the ships. I used to say the nice thing about serving on a surfer ship was that you knew afterwards that nothing else you ever encountered would be quite as hard as having served on a surfer ship and gone through that kind of intense environment where 4 hours sleep a night was kind of a luxury. I also try to bring in logistics because that's very important. Ships carry a lot of stuff, but they still need resupply, and that drives a lot of the decisions commanders have to make. Is how much supplies do I have? How much fuel do I have? How much food? All this kind of stuff. And where am I going to get more, and how am I going to get it? These drive a lot of the decisions the commanders have to make, prevent them from doing some things they might want to do. So I factor that in because I think the more realism you bring to that, the more realistic the story is. And then people who haven't experienced that environment can say, oh, yeah, I understand. You're low on fuel. You got to get more fuel, and you don't know where to find it. So it brings in an element that allows people who haven't been there to realize the sort of challenges people are facing. So those are the main considerations I put in for when I'm thinking about spaceships.
So just thinking about all the things that we look at in fiction, right? There's things that we can do well. There's things that we don't, even when we know things, right? It's creating that believability and whatnot. So Frank, I'm going to start with you on this one. But when you think in terms of just crafting story and with all of this idea of Navy or space and vessels and all these sorts of things in mind, what's something that you think anybody that's wanting to write in this space needs to make sure they're considering?
Well, before I answer that, I have to mention to Jack that I think the Emperor is mightily disappointed in your lack of faith in his engineer structure of pointy-shaped spaceships. If you don't have a pointy-shaped ship, how is it possibly going to crash into the second Death Star?
Oh, yeah.
So, I just can't believe you said that. I was like, I'm just expecting there to be anyway.
And everybody knows that the command structure has to be separated from the hull, up high above everything else, out in the open. Yeah,
with little tiny spiny holes that hold it together.
Where it's an easy target.
Yeah, exactly. From my perspective, from what I have learned in writing about the Navy is, and again, my reference point is World War II, but I think it's still the case. It's vast. It's gigantic. It is a moving machine with a lot of different parts, and the command structure is really good at keeping the parts mostly together. But like Jack talked about with the 3 different missile systems on a ship that was designed for one. I mean, from my perspective, that's very normal. I was not surprised to hear that at all. Because what I saw just on the civilian side, which is a lot less complicated, that was going on all the time. Things like that would happen all the time, and nobody would understand why one person had a really clear idea about this thing because either they couldn't or they wouldn't tell everybody else why they were doing it. And as a civilian, that coming from a corporation which was mostly transparent, that was incredibly shocking and surprising until I realized, no, everybody's expecting it, so they kind of live with it. But in terms of writing about the Navy itself as a superstructure, how vast and complex it is, just I don't think can be overestimated or overemphasized. It's just because and it is a very cumbersome thing that rolls along. And I don't say this because I worked with the Navy, but having worked with people who were working with other military branches, there's no question that the United States Navy is one of the most efficient machines there is. There's probably nobody that's as efficient as the Navy, which sounds like a really good ad, except for the part where the bar is not very high. But the Navy does better than the Navy does better than a lot better than the Army or the Air Force by stretches. And of course, the Marine Corps has no faults whatsoever, as we all know. That's what we say in order to not get punched out or whatever. But that would be my focus, is like understand that to me, because of where I'm writing from, the most important part of looking at the Navy is to look at little tiny stories that one sailor or one officer has within the context of a big theater of war or just a big ship. Because those little tiny stories is where all the real juicy stuff is as a narrator and as a storyteller. So that's what I would look at. And that you'll never understand it. And that you'll turn a corner and you'll suddenly encounter something you didn't think existed, but just happens to be there.
Don?
I think you need to be willing to poke at a lot of places for your research. Whether it's there's all sorts of groups, whether it's Reddit or Facebook groups or military veteran organizations. There's so much information that can be gleaned if you're willing to go out and search for it. And in that regard, also, you want to have beta readers that understand things about the military better than you do, or certainly better than I do, that are, not your brother-in-law or somebody who's going to be nice about what you've written, but somebody who's just going to tell you, no, they wouldn't do that. This is the situation. That's, completely wrong. You need to fix it. And you need to be looking for that information, and you need to be looking for those people at the get-go, not at the last second when you really want to press that button to publish or send it off to the traditional publisher or whatever, because it is so much easier when you are writing to incorporate subtle bits of important information as you go. And if you then put them in at the last second, they're going to look like they were put in at the last second. So you need to be thinking about that ahead of time, not at the last minute.
Jack?
I think one important thing is that stuff breaks. Stuff breaks. Stuff doesn't work the way it's supposed to work, the way it's supposedly designed to work. You have to deal with equipment that isn't perfect by any means. And as a matter of fact, equipment that may have serious flaws. But when it comes to equipment problems and anything else, that always comes down to people. And that's true of the Navy. It's true of any military organization. People will cause most of your problems. Whether it's disciplinary problems or doing the wrong thing or misunderstanding an order, anything like that. People will cause most of your problems, but people will also be the solution to your problems. You can count on them to come up with ways to do things that no rational person might ever dream of, or that an expert would say, well, you can't do that. I once had it was a cast aluminum brace on a fire control radar, and it broke clean. And, what are we going to do? We're out at sea, and you can't weld aluminum, cast aluminum. That's impossible, we were told. Well, we had a second-class petty officer who hadn't been taught you couldn't weld aluminum. And so he gave it a shot, and he welded that sucker back in place. It was strong, and he fixed it, even though it was supposed to be impossible. So those two aspects of things, that you're operating in a very imperfect environment as the ship and everything else, but the people around you, they're going to create extra problems for you, but they're also going to be ultimately what gets you through, and what saves the day is going to be those people. And that can be hard on those people. But in the end, a lot of them will come through when you need them.
Dennis?
For me, it goes back to the people, the characters. One of the things that I play with is very early on. There's a young ensign. She's fresh out of school. She hasn't qualified her watch yet. And how the crew treat her as a non-qual, encouraging her, but, ragging on her a bit. And then immediately after she gets qualified, the next person senior to her and her start getting into a prank war. And they go through this series of pranks, which I won't spoil anything, but I will say that every single prank that they go through, I have personally seen done. And that was a lot of fun. But eventually her character grows and she becomes someone who risks her life to save the rest of the crew. And it's just I really love her story. And in fact, I'm playing with her character now 10 years later. So that'll be fun.
I'm going to throw one last question out there, because, we could spend hours talking about this. We haven't talked about things such as combat. We haven't talked about a lot of other things as well. But I want to make sure we at least, get a chance to cover some of the other stuff as well. So, Don, what's something we haven't talked about so far tonight you think we ought to mention?
Well, I think one of the things that we haven't talked about is military families. And the impact that the military has on the families, and the difficulty sometimes in communicating, and the fact that events occur and decisions have to be made, sometimes without the communication, and the stress that can put on the family and, on the people who are out at sea, not being able to deal with those things, and not being able to have the interpersonal relationships that they intended to have in their life. And I just think that that's a tremendous thing that gets very little focus in your kind of typical military movie or action adventure tale. And I think that that's a big thing in the lives of those people that gets overlooked by a lot of authors.
Jack, what about you? What's something that we haven't touched on yet?
Well, it's kind of been alluded to, but I think it needs to be emphasized. The informal ways of getting things done to get around the rigidities of the system. A really good chief petty officer can find you a part, even if that part officially doesn't exist anywhere. You just have to learn not to ask questions. When they find the part, don't ask them where they got it or how they got it. That's the way you do it. And there's a lot of that goes on beneath the surface to keep the rigid structure from cracking. Again, it comes down to relationships and people who know how to work their way through the cracks in the system to get things done when doing everything by the rules isn't going to get them done. We had one supply officer who I remember fondly because he could get things done. He was a good pork chop because even if the system said this stuff isn't available, he could find a way to get it. And he did that not by following the rules, but by kind of stretching them a bit when they absolutely didn't need to be. And that's a huge part of it. And it plays into effective combat tactics as well, because when you're in a battle, if you're just following a rigid set of rules, this is how we're supposed to fight, you lose. You have to be able to see things to exploit in the way the enemy's doing things, and know what you're capable of doing, that not necessarily by the book. And that's, you look at the great commanders, and they know the book. They know the book really well, but they also know how, because they know it so well, they know how not to follow it when necessary. And all of that gets past the whole idea of the military rigidity that people mostly think of. That actually it's the informal stuff that gets things done a great part of the time.
Make work around the system. Dennis?
How about counting ammunition? I have a group of Marines who have to go in and they bring a lot of ammo and a lot of supplies, and they lose most of it. So they end up having to very carefully count what they have. One of the things that they have is what they jokingly refer to as SPGs, spider-propelled grenades. Basically grenades with 6 legs that can go mount themselves where they need to go and explode during the battle at the right time. But then when you're done, you recall the ones that weren't used, and then you got to count how many you got left. And you have to be careful and strategize until you're down to your last few.
Frank?
Well, the thing that comes to my mind that it seems to be kind of it's always in every story that I ever read or anything that I ever come across about the Navy is the balance between morale and discipline. And it's always a subtext. It's hardly ever brought forward that I've ever seen. And I keep thinking about that in terms of so there was this thing that was going on during the war, during World War II, that had started prior to the war, where how the Navy was dealing with bad behavior. So mostly the way it was dealt with was, if they had to deal with it in a way that they were going to make an example of people, was the blue ticket system, which was it was gotten rid of by 1949, but it started in the 30s, or maybe prior to that, into the 20s. But with the blue ticket system, anybody going in who was black, they knew that was going to be everybody knew that was held over their heads. And the congressional hearings about that after the war, it's mostly these people coming from the black newspapers, because they were some of the big advocates at the time, talking about all the stories they knew of different sailors who had been given a blue ticket basically for mouthing off. That's basically what it was for most cases. And how it had this weird effect that it increased morale among the white sailors, and it decreased morale, of course, among the black sailors. And so there was this whole thing of like discipline and morale and how to balance the two out and what tools to use. And then, of course, the blue ticket system was basically a big blind spot for most of the command structure, because they used it specifically to punish 2 specific groups of people, which were black sailors and gay sailors. But of course, the black sailors got it worse than the gay ones did, because the gay ones would have been white for the most part. And so that in the institutional part of racism that was built into the military, because it was part of the country, that was, played out really big. But that whole balance, and I'm looking at it through a narrow lens, but that whole balance between morale and discipline, and which is, when there's too much discipline, it affects morale. And when morale is boosted too much, it affects discipline. And again, I'm saying this as a stranger, as an outsider, so I don't really understand it because I've not been in it. But from the outside, it looks like it's a real fine line. And I think that's probably not talked about a lot in literature. It's either talked about with a sledgehammer, but it's not talked about with the subtlety that in which I think it probably actually occurs.
Well, we could keep going on this for a long while, but before we do get out of here, let's make sure everybody knows where to find you guys, websites, social media, all that kind of good stuff, and whatever books everybody needs to be adding to that to-be-read pile too. So, Frank, where can we find you?
You can find me at my website, frankwbutterfield.com. You can also find me on Facebook, although I'm not really on the socials much anymore. the first book in my series is called The Unexpected Heiress, and that's the first story where Nick Williams is seen to be a private detective, and it has a little bit of his history, but as you go along, you learn more and more about what he did. I've got a couple of really good short stories that are set specifically in the Navy. The one I love the most is St. Patrick's Day, 1945, and it's when he's in New Guinea, and he has like an adventure where he goes on leave and things happen. But it covers a whole bunch of little vignettes of things that I love about digging into how things worked at that time, particularly as the war was winding down and they were at the end of the beyond, and how they basically didn't have a lot of supervision. So anyway, I just wanted to say thank you very much for having me. And also part of the reason I was here was because I wanted to hear what these other guys had to say. Because I do feel like I'm an outsider and I don't really understand a lot of what I'm writing about, even though there's a lot of research, there's a lot of information available because of when the time period is covered, because there's a lot of oral histories about that. But I'm really grateful for the other participants here because I've learned an awful lot.
Don, where can we find you?
DonaldJBingle.com. You can also find my author page on Amazon. And social media at Donald J. Bingle. Like I said before, I've got spy thrillers and future military sci-fi. Strangely enough, the two works that I have that deal most with ships, the one I'm pushing right now is Morse Code Mysteries and Missives. That has 3 stories, 2 by me, 1 a relevant piece of nonfiction. And strangely enough, those are presented in print in 300 pages of Morse code, which you can leaf through, or you can then go to the audio links and listen to almost 12 hours of Morse code. And then you can check the stories, which are in clear English, in the back in the print and Kindle versions. There's also an audiobook version. And very oddly enough, the thing that most specifically deals with the Navy in a bizarre way is in an urban fantasy series I wrote with Gene Raby called The Love-Hate Case Files. It's set in San Francisco. And there's just a very, very sad story about the naval yard in San Francisco. And without going into too much detail, what happened there because ships that were used in the Bikini Atoll nuclear explosion were towed there and sandblasted there.
Jack, where can we find you?
Well, my webpage is jackcampbell.com. I'm on Facebook. There's a group on Facebook, Fans of the Lost Fleet, because that's my primary most successful series, The Lost Fleet. And of course, Amazon page. And as said earlier, the first book in the Lost Fleet series is Dauntless. And I think, Implacable just came out. That's the 14th book in the 6-book series. So it's been popular. I've been very fortunate that way. I also had the Jag in Space series, started with A Just Determination, which was based not only on my shipboard experience, but also my experience as a ship's legal officer, which is where they give you 3 weeks of training on how lawyers talk, and then you're supposed to advise the commanding officer on legal things. So it's just another bear trap you get thrown into. And aside from that, the only other thing to mention is I've got a new series coming out in May. This is the first book in that, in Our Stars. Starts out with the Earth being destroyed, and it's nonetheless a hopeful story.
Yeah,
One way to start the day.
Yeah, I mean, it's I'm grateful as well for the opportunity to do this panel and then to meet some other writers in the field and exchange experiences, because in some ways it's always the same, but it's also always different for everybody.
Dennis?
Yeah, you can find me at automatedempire.com. There are links there to all of my socials, Facebook, Instagram, and Mastodon. My Automated Empire series is out on Amazon and Chris Kennedy Publications. And Frank, you might be interested to know that a few years ago they made a very accurate documentary about what life is really like underway on a submarine. It's called Down Periscope with Kelsey Grammer. I'm just saying, too close for comfort.
And I've had the pleasure of being your host this evening, Jim Nettles. You can find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentialsworkshops.com, speculativefictionacademy.com, creatingpros.com, and of course, your ConTinual. And we'll see you guys again soon. And thanks to everybody for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.